I got somebody messaging. Okay. I'm gonna... Okay.
Are we live?
I don't
I have
know.
no idea.
That.
We could try the Twitch stream and see, but I'm afraid
I
it'll
just
make
brought it up. It looks like we're live.
Oh, are we?
Look at
Okay.
that.
Okay. Okay, so we're on. Yes? All right, I'm going to assume we're on. What?
Let's just pretend we are.
Okay, we can always start over if someone comes in and tells us that we started early.
It's
Hi.
Like, go ahead.
Oh, that was okay. All right. Hi, welcome to the Furry Fiction panel, where we will talk about furry fiction and how it is a rapidly growing subgenre. But first, we will introduce ourselves. So I'm Mary E. Loud, and I've written like about a dozen novels and 200 short stories. Not all of them are furry, but a lot of them are. And I was the editor of Fur Planet's Roar anthology series for, I think, 5 issues. It's a vaguely yearly anthology of furry stories. And now I'm the editor and founder of Zooscape, which is a professionally paying online magazine devoted entirely to furry fiction. And now one of the two of you should introduce yourselves. Ian.
There you go.
Okay, so I'm Ian Keller. I write furry fiction under Ian Madison Keller and furry urban fantasy under Roan Rosser. So I have, I think, 15 published novels now and about as many published short stories. And I've also edited a few anthologies. Roar is at 11 and Shark Week and a couple others. So, and I've been writing furry fiction for about 7 years now, I think.
Me.
Yeah.
I'm Frances Polly, and I write, since we're counting, I think last time I counted, I was over 30 novels. I write novels, short fiction, interactive fiction, and web serials now on Kindle Vella. I did not start out writing furry, but I've been writing furry for about, I think, 6 or 7 years now, and really kind of settled in, and that's where I want to be right now. So.
So the three of us have actually done panels about furry fiction tons of times together over the years, but they are usually at furry conventions where people already know what furry is. So here we're going to start a little differently than usual and talk about what furry fiction is, because that's something that people seem to get really confused about. And it's really very simple. It's just fiction with anthropomorphized characters, basically. Usually they're animals, although, there are borders where people will argue about what exactly is furry and what isn't. I mean, furry as a fandom is a much bigger thing than just furry fiction. There's art, there's costumes. That's the stuff people see. The really big stuff is the costumes, but there's a lot of fiction too. And then the question is, what exactly counts as furry? And furries love to argue about that. But basically, when it comes down to it, what draws people into furry, what brings readers and writers in, is they want stories about talking animals. And that doesn't mean they have to literally speak out loud. Like the rabbits in Watership Down, they talk to each other, but they can't talk to humans. Or the book Raptor Red. That's a fantastic furry book. The raptors don't talk to each other because it's really trying to get into what raptors would have really been like. But it's getting into their minds. You're seeing how they think. And so it's anthropomorphizing them. It's making them more human-like in their thinking than they probably actually were. Frances, do you want to add to what furry fiction is, how you see it?
I think you kind of nailed it. I think it's stepping outside of the human perspective and and embedding in a different sort of character. So, and I'm on the team, everything, you know, everything can be furry, from toasters to scalies to bugs, but it's sort of that alien / non-human perspective for me. That's the draw.
Yeah.
Ian? What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna like throw things to one or the other of you. I'm gonna try to alternate so we don't always go in the same order.
Okay. Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. Like, furry fiction is just, I mean, it's kind of an animal centric point of view for most of it. So
I think people do get stuck on the borderlines, like
yeah.
werewolves.
Yeah.
There are things about werewolves that are so furry. And then there are werewolf things where the werewolf like jumps out at you once. It's a jump scare. It's the monster, and you don't really get into its mind or spend any time with it. And that's just horror. But I mean, that's sometimes a very personal line of what exactly feels furry to you and what doesn't.
Yeah.
But in general, furry fiction tends to favor the animal point of view somewhat. So for me, if a werewolf story ends with the people being happy about turning into werewolves, it's a whole lot more likely to be furry than if it ends with them all just killing all the werewolves.
Yeah.
Okay. Also, you brought up scalies, Francis, and that is something I see people get stuck on a lot. Like, what if it's not fur? And it's like, well, it's still an animal. Scales, feathers, you know, dolphins. These are all animals. If you get into their heads, that's furry fiction, because that's what brings the readers and writers together. And what makes a genre is really more about the heart of what pulls people together. So you can argue about what exactly counts as science fiction or fantasy. Like, is Star Wars sci-fi, or is it fantasy because of the Force? But it's got spaceships and robots, so sci-fi fans come to it. And, you know, just because people have those arguments doesn't mean there isn't a genre there. Science fiction and fantasy are clearly genres that exist, that people love and come to. And you can argue about what exactly is furry fiction, but it's still something that people love and come for. And so that's a genre. And it keeps getting bigger. So do either of you have anything that you want to add about like setting us up with a definition?
I think we're covered pretty good.
Okay. How about we talk about the types of furry fiction? I think I threw this to Ian first last time, or Francis.
I think it's Ian's turn.
Yeah, I think it's my turn.
Okay.
So as far as types of furry fiction, the way Mary and I broke it down in the book that we wrote about furry fiction is we kind of there's a scale that goes from, you know, talking animals to a little more feral, to like anthro people, like anthro animals that walk on two legs, to almost like human but only have like a little bit of furry, like geckos. So there is kind of a scale, and furry fiction, like characters in furry fiction can fall on different places in the scale, even in the same book. So it's a little hard to quantify that way, but that's kind of how I think about it. So, I don't know if that's what you meant, Mary, but that's where my mind went.
That's good. There are different ways to anthropomorphize animals. There's also different genres that you can combine furry fiction with. It's kind of some people call it a meta genre, although I don't know that that's so different from other genres. You can have sci-fi detective stories, you can have sci-fi romances, and furry also combines really well with pretty much every other genre of fiction. Do you have thoughts on types of furry fiction, Francis?
I was kind of leaning the same way. I shy away from the meta genre too, because look at romance. Romance is a genre and it has every single other genre under it. I wouldn't mention, I like that Ian's example of the scale of anthropomorphism, but also, you know, and what types of furry fiction are there? You know, there's all the same types of fiction as other fiction. There's children's stories, there's YA, there's adult fiction, there's erotic fiction. You know, it's not all any one of those. And in fact, most of our first introduction to furry fiction, I would say almost everyone's first introduction, is children's books, because children's books are full of animal characters. You know, I think that's probably where the love originates.
I think that's why it's growing so fast, because kids are constantly reading and watching furry fiction like Zootopia. And who
Or
wants
even
to grow
older,
up?
the old like Disney Robin Hood movie with the
Yeah.
foxes.
And if you don't have to grow up, why grow up? And if
Yeah.
you do have to grow up, why not keep the things that you loved? And animal characters are really easy to love. People love animal characters. They're fun, they're colorful, they bring more variety to a piece of fiction.
And they let you explore other cultures, like the novel The Bees. It's all about exploring the culture of bees, and it's so different than humans, and it makes it so much fun being able to play with things other than human culture. It's kind of like with sci-fi writers writing about aliens, but they're not aliens.
But so many. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's the beauty of it, is you get the alien perspective, but in something familiar.
Yeah.
I mean, we've all had a pet, or most of us have had a pet at some point, so it feels more intimate than an alien story.
Well, and so many aliens in sci-fi are based on animals. If you dig into, you know, what inspired the writer in the first place, it'll be like, well, this really deep sea creature is so weird, and so I wanted to write about it. Because it's easier to make up something that feels really creative and out there if you start from a jumping off point that's familiar. And there are just so many models in the real world. Like butterflies are weird and fascinating, and they make great aliens.
They love insects. Mantid aliens are really popular. Yeah.
So I think that kind of brings us to how furry fiction combines with science fiction and fantasy, I think, particularly well. And it's why it falls under the general umbrella of speculative fiction. Because anytime you're anthropomorphizing a character that's not human, you're speculating. That's what literally, it's speculative fiction. So even if, you know, you're speculating only so far as these characters are basically foxes and rabbits, but they walk around and go to Starbucks, you're still speculating. And it might feel kind of mainstream, but if they're animals, it's a type of speculative fiction. That said, furry fiction combines especially well with fantasy and sci-fi, because those are two genres that give you a lot of different ways to explain why you have furry characters. And there is furry fiction where it's never explained. You just jump in and you read about it. I mean, think the TV show BoJack Horseman. No one ever explains why the main character is a horse.
Yeah.
You just have to take that and run with it. But in a lot of fiction, a lot of the fun comes in explaining how the world works and how it got there. And sci-fi and fantasy have a lot of opportunities for that. Do either of you want to talk about types of ways to explain furry characters in sci-fi and fantasy?
Sure. Do you want to? I'll pick one, or you pick another. Or,
Yeah.
So sci-fi is fabulous because you have aliens sort of built into it, but you also have genetic modifications, which is one of my favorites. Traditionally, I think you have people uplifting animals. Like, I think that goes all the way back to Wells and the Island of Dr. Moreau was the first, human animals being made into people. But I really like to go the other way and have people sort of modifying their DNA to be more animal-like. So you can pretty much do any and all of the above. And I've even seen almost like a twist on the zombie idea, like it's a virus or a weird mutation or something at random, and you can get away with that in sci-fi too.
Yeah, that's I have a series of stories where I did it the virus way, where virus infects animals and they start becoming more intelligent and anthropomorphic because of this virus, and exploring how that changed the world of now all the animals can talk.
You've also got some furry fantasy though.
Yeah, I usually write fantasy. And fantasy's fun because you can have dragons. You can also have, I really like shifters. Shifters are my favorite. I don't know what that thing is, if anybody can hear it. Okay, I have something making sounds on my computer. Sorry. But yeah, I really like shifters are probably my favorite, and those go really well with fantasy. It's a little harder to explain shifters with science fiction, I think. But fantasy, like it's magic. They can just turn into a fox now. I really enjoy playing with that kind of thing. So
Yeah. So there are a whole bunch of different ways to explain furry characters, and the way you explain them will kind of determine what kind of world and story you're writing about. When you get into the genre, you see that there are tropes, just as there are in sci-fi and fantasy. Like faster than light travel is explained in like various standard ways in sci-fi, and there are standard ways to explain furry characters in furry fiction. Like Francis mentioned uplift, which I think the word uplift came from David Brin's books.
Yeah.
And that is a really standard way to explain furry characters, that some species took an animal species and increased its intelligence and abilities. And they could do it for different reasons. Making soldiers is a common one, but you can be trying to, in my Otters in Space series, people uplifted cats and dogs, mostly just because they wanted to. Because there is always
I would totally uplift my dogs if I could. So I totally understand that.
Yeah.
I think there's a precedence in sci-fi and fantasy that makes furry fiction just really like at home there. And most science fiction and fantasy worlds, the really popular ones, most of them, I think I would even say, not all, but have at least one character that's either, the witch is familiar that's super chatty and snarky, or the alien sidekick that's got animal features. So it's already kind of built in.
Like Star Wars, you've got the Ewoks, you've got Chewbacca. I still hold that Yoda is basically a fennec fox crossed with a frog, and I'm gonna write that story someday. So they're just blended in. I think my favorite thing to do is to just say, why not have it all? I like writing science fiction, especially, and so I'll have the aliens who happened to evolve to look similar to Earth animals, or similar enough that the human perspective narrating the novel will describe them that way, but also have people who will change themselves and creatures who've been uplifted. I just like, why not have everything in the world? The real world is a big, complicated, confusing place. If I'm making my own universe, I figure it can be big and complicated and confusing, but in a more fun way. Okay, so we've talked about types of furry fiction. Let's talk about the furry community for a while, about kind of what the shape of that is, because I think a lot of people don't know that there is an active writing community presence. Well, I think a lot of people don't know about furry conventions, and they don't know, even the people who go to furry conventions don't always know about the writing presence there. Do either of you want to start off on that? Or
I've lost track of whose turn it is.
Yeah, I have to.
you know what? Maybe it's my turn to start out.
Okay.
So I discovered the furry writing community a little over a decade ago. I'd written this book called Otters in Space, and knew that I couldn't sell it in a normal way, because the advice that you always get is, we'll find something similar. And there was nothing similar. It was like Redwall crossed with Arthur C. Clarke, which is not still something that I see out there very much. So I went tracking down Redwall forums online, which were mostly defunct. People weren't using them anymore, but that got me to a furry forum, which then, after hanging out there for a while, I discovered that there was a convention up in Seattle, and I had no idea what to expect, but I packed my self-published books in a bag and went up to it, and was shocked and amazed to discover that at this convention, where yes, people walk around wearing like full fursuits, like mascot costumes, which they've gotten really good at making, and some of them are just beautiful works of art. But there's that. But there were also whole tables in the dealer's den just filled with books. And the covers were, Furry Fiction has some of the best covers, because furry as a fandom has so many amazing artists. So when you go to get cover art, you have some amazing options to work with. You know, artists you can hire who will do really beautiful jobs. So there were all these books, and I got to talking to people, and they were actual furry devoted publishers. There is a furry publishing scene with publishers who put out just furry books. And that's still kind of amazing to me. But, you know, that was a decade ago, and it keeps growing. There's a Furry Writers Guild. There's a bunch of us, actually, and so many more than there were a decade ago. Now I'm tossing it off to one of you, maybe.
It's funny because I had a sort of similar experience, but it also had to do with rainforest. I was writing science fiction and fantasy, and I was at a sci-fi con, and I saw a flyer for rainforest, and it just kind of blew my mind. I wanted to know more about what the heck this furry thing was. And so I was looking at furry, the fandom, and just trying to find anything I could about it. And I stumbled into a forum, and somebody mentioned the guild. And I went, there are writers, you know, in this. I had no concept that this was a thing, even though I was writing books that had, I think we all were writing books that had at least one, you know, animal character, or one shifter, or one, because we were sort of subconsciously wanting that in the book anyway. But yeah, then the guild just, you know, all of a sudden I realized this was a legit thing, and there were other people doing it, and publishers and awards and all of the good things. So
that's right. We have 3 awards for furry fiction in the fandom. There's one that's for furry art more generally, but they're fiction categories. It's called the Ursa Major Awards, and it's been going on, I don't know, decades, longer than I've been aware of it by quite a bit.
Yeah.
And then in the last decade, there are 2 more that have popped up. The Coyote Awards, which is nominated and voted on by members of the Furry Writers Guild. So it's kind of the furry answer to the Nebulas, whereas the Ursa Majors are more like the Hugos. And then there's a new juried award called the Leo Literary Awards, where they actually get a panel of judges. And it's pretty exciting to have these awards. I know they're not as huge and recognized as the Nebulas and the Hugos, but those also had to start somewhere, and these have now been around for years. And you can get awards specifically for writing furry fiction.
Well, I like pointing new readers in that direction too, because it's like, okay, the people have nominated the best of for these awards. I mean, not always. I mean, people are going to slip through the cracks, but it's a good place to start finding some good furry fiction, because you don't even have to look at the winners. You can just look at the nominees and pick out stuff that looks interesting to you. It's a great place to start if you don't know where to start reading furry fiction. Like go to the Ursa Major Awards and look up the nominees for the last few years, pick up some books.
They also keep a recommended anthropomorphics list. So
yes,
that
I forgot about that. Yeah.
Every year, that's on the Ursa Major website, and it, you know, will have more things than just the top couple that got nominated.
Yeah, because people will submit anything and everything to that list over the year, so you can go there. And
yeah, it's a great resource for finding things to read. The furry writing community also has done a lot with anthologies. Anthologies are pretty popular with furry writing. A lot of how furry writing works is there are so many furry conventions, and they keep growing and getting bigger. And the publishers will actually go to the conventions and hand sell actual paper books, and people really do buy them. So they can actually sell anthologies, and you get short fiction in an anthology. And then like here's one book you can buy with like a whole range of different authors to try out. And from a writer's perspective, it can be really fun to try to write for them. They usually have themes. And so it's, I don't know, I think it's fun to try to write for anthologies with themes. Like Ian put one out just during the pandemic called Shark Week. And everything had to be underwater animals. Yeah. Or ocean related.
It had to be ocean related. Like as you can tell from my shirt, I like ocean stuff. My turtles here. But yes, I agree. I really like themes because if I just sit down to write a short story, I'm like, I need some constraints. I know that sounds funny that my imagination works better with constraints, but it really helps me write stories too. So
Watching how they get sold in person, the themes also help sell them, because you'll be like, this one's about paradise, this one's about resistance, and people will pick the theme that speaks to them. All right. Also, I wanted to mention the conventions where you can buy books in the dealer stand. They'll also have panels. That's how Ian and Francis and I have practiced doing panels like this together, although usually in person, not staring at my own computer screen. I'm still not used to that. Where we can actually see the audience, which we can't right now. But the writing panels at furry conventions are really not that different from writing panels at sci-fi conventions. It's the same basic thing. It's just writers talking to people also interested in writing about how to write. They're very much the same thing.
yeah, they are.
We also have we have the retreat. We have RAR. It's in my mind because I just finished it, and I know that Ian's done RAR before too. It's a 6-day, usually in person. This year it was virtual, which is why I got to go. But a really immersive critique and writing retreat, and it's modeled after Clarion, just a smaller version, and it's run by Clarion graduates. And if you're in the sci-fi and fantasy community, you probably know what Clarion is, but it's just a really intensive, fully immersed 6-day experience where you're critiquing and writing and meeting other writers, and it kind of sets you up beautifully to have a support group and a critique group going forward after that.
Yeah.
As an editor, when I was editing Roar, which is ROAR, as opposed to RAR, which is the thing Francis was just talking about, which is RAWR. But when I was editing Roar, the submissions from people who then mentioned that they just finished RAR tended to pop as like being particularly well written. I could see the positive effects. It was evident in the writing that people were really getting a whole lot out of it, which was very neat.
Yeah, I think Mary actually bought my Roar story from the writing retreat for Roar 10. So yeah. Yeah, puppy tax. If you see, I had my dog there. She's full grown. She's just tiny. She's 6 pounds, so she's not actually a puppy.
Hey, so we've talked about what furry fiction is and the different types and the community. I don't think we've talked a whole lot about the Furry Writers Guild. I'm not sure that there's a whole lot. Is there a lot to say about it other than that it's there and it's neat?
They do have they have 2 chats every week. They're still doing 9 o'clock on Thursday in the Discord and a 4 on Tuesday. And they usually have a topic and everyone shows up. And
yeah, and the Discord is pretty active too. It's a great place to find critique partners who know about furry writing, because I think we've all had all 3 of us have had this experience of bringing furry stuff to a non-furry group, and they're like, but why are the dogs talking? So you don't have to worry about questions like that if you get critiquers from the group. So that's nice.
I've found that normal sci-fi fantasy groups can kind of be trained to get used to critiquing furry fiction, but there is a learning curve.
Yeah.
I think I always got, but what are their hands like? It's like, well, watch the Puss in Boots movie. The way that paw works, it's a paw, but it's a hand. There you go.
I mean, you don't even have to explain it like My Little Pony. They have like hooves. Like, how are they manipulating stuff? They have hooves.
Who knows?
Who knows? Just use your imagination.
Yeah. Also, it's worth saying that the chats Ian and Francis were just talking about are open to anyone. To join the Furry Writers Guild, you have to have had published or sold 1 or 2 pieces of furry fiction. It's really not a very high bar for entering, but most of the resources are available to everyone, even without becoming a member. The main benefit to being a member is you can participate in voting on the Coyote Awards. a little side note, the Coyote Awards and the Leo Awards both give out like cute little plushies about that tall. And it's a really fun type of award to win because you get this adorable little plush animal. All right. So maybe now we move to talking about how to write furry fiction. About maybe how to. It's so much easier when we have an audience actually ask.
Well, I've got the Twitch up, so if people want to ask us questions, I can pull them out.
Okay.
Are
there questions?
Not so far that I see.
Okay.
So I'll keep an eye on it.
Actually, maybe we should talk about the different venues for publishing furry fiction. Like what markets are available. Does one of you want to start on that?
I guess I can start. Like we've mentioned anthologies. Like that's one of the great things about being part of the Furry Writers Guild, because they always post all the anthology calls. So you can just go to their page and see a list of all the currently open furry anthology calls for short stories. And then as Mary mentioned earlier, there's furry publishers who will sometimes publish novels, although they're harder to get. They don't take submissions.
Made everything harder.
Yeah,
especially
the pandemic's made
for a writing community that really functions on hand selling books in person. That's really made it more difficult.
Yeah, and then a lot of furry writers self-publish too. Like I self-publish my novels. I know a lot of other furry writers do. So
we have a really excellent pro-paying periodical online.
Yeah, Mary's magazine.
Also, yeah, I was going to say self-publishing, but I wouldn't rule out other publishers, especially sci-fi and fantasy. If you have any kind of a speculative element, or you can lean into that a little, why not throw it at them and see? I certainly know there's furry stories that have made it into mainstream markets quite a bit. So I think that it's awesome that we have our places, but I wouldn't want to see us like self-reject from other places too.
Yeah,
this is true. Furry stories and fiction has been around since long before people started calling it furry. I mean, like we were mentioning David Brin's Uplift books. Those are just labeled as sci-fi. CJ Cherry's Chernur series. These are lions on a spaceship. You don't get a whole lot furrier than that, but it's just labeled as sci-fi. So that happens over and over again. Myself, I've had novels published by Fur Planet and Goal Publications, which sadly has not survived the pandemic. There's also Sofa Wolf, which I have not had luck with. But I've also had books published by publishers outside of the furry fandom. I've got a trilogy coming out from a publisher of dark fantasy, and the main character is a squirrel, but it's dark fantasy about a squirrel.
Yeah, and then your sci-fi operatic novels.
I've got a space opera trilogy from Aethon Books, and they do general sci-fi fantasy, but it's kind of Star Warsy, Star Trekky. Like here are space stations and spaceships, and a lot of the characters are animal-like aliens.
So we did get a question on the Twitch. So that's probably a good place to get that. So the question is, where is the limit from going from innocent furry fiction to adult furry fiction? And that's kind of hard to answer. It's almost the same as non-furry fiction, basically.
Yeah.
It's not really any different.
Well, the one difference is that because furry fiction gets furries in general get weirdly demonized and turned into scapegoats just for liking animal things. I'd say furry fiction is generally actually more cautious about dividing up things that might have anything vaguely slightly adult from things that are completely safe for younger people. That, in fantasy and sci-fi, you don't see a sharp division. There will be books that, suddenly there will be a very adult scene out of nowhere. And it just, it's normal sci-fi fantasy. Whereas with furry, that would get it labeled separately and wouldn't show it to younger people at the conventions, because furries are extra careful because there's a history of furries getting demonized. But it's really, other than that, not different. I mean, the Suki Stackhouse vampire novels, those were extremely adult, but they're not, put off somewhere separate.
Well, I was going to say some of the erotic shifter novels flirt with lines that we don't like to flirt with. We're very clear that there's a difference between animal people and animals. So, yeah, I would say, and most of the furry erotic calls that I've seen have the same restrictions, don't do this, this, and this, that a mainstream adult call would have.
Mostly, I mean, it's people writing fiction. It's people writing furry fiction. Sometimes people like to write about adult things. So, furry's not any different from anything else that people do.
So there's another question in the Twitch, if we're done with this one, which I think we are. Where do you see the future of furry fiction going? I'm going to lob this one to Mary because she's very passionate about that.
Oh, so that convention I went to, I said, right, I first went to a furry convention and there were these tables full of books. And there was this writer, Phil Goyce. He likes to write about rabbits, people turning themselves into rabbits mostly. He writes lovely stuff. And he did this panel where he talked about how furry fiction is where science fiction was 100 years ago. That it's this new weird genre that people don't understand, but that it's growing and it's rising. And I wish I could just have his speech, because it was so good. And it's part of why I'm here now, a decade later, talking about furry fiction, and why I, put together Zooscape, so that there can be something that people it's something to point at and be like, here, go look up Zooscape online. You will find a bunch of awesome sci-fi and fantasy stories that are furry, and they're labeled furry, because I had felt like I was looking for furry fiction for years before I found the label. I just, I read the Redwall books and I read Watership Down, and then I ran out of those because there were only 6 Redwall books when I read them. But you'd run out anyway. And I wanted more of that. And occasionally you could find little bits of it in science fiction and fantasy. The Chinur series was such a big deal for me, and David Brin's books. And they're not labeled. You can't just go to a shelf or just, search for, I want this kind of fiction and have it show up. It's out there. It's always been out there. There's tons of it, but people don't put the label on it. So I was just ecstatic to find there's a name for the thing that I love more than almost anything else. And now I can find it because I go to where the furry fiction is, and that's where the thing that I love is. And now I run a magazine and I put out a call and I'm like, hey, people, send me furry stories. And they do. We get submissions from all kinds of people, big names in sci-fi and fantasy, people who've won big awards in sci-fi and fantasy, because a lot of sci-fi fantasy writers also write some furry stuff, because a lot of writers have, some idea about oh, I want to write about this cat shifter. I've been reading a lot of Seanan McGuire lately, and the book of hers I'm reading right now is about werewolves, and she's got these fairies who can turn into cats in the October Day series, and there's just this furry characters kind of mixed in all over the place. And what we're seeing, I think, as time is passing, is that people are getting less weirded out by it. That it's just this is a normal thing. That was actually what I found with a lot of people that I knew when I was writing Otters in Space. And they'd be like, why otters? And I never knew why. It was because I wanted it that way. And then after I discovered that there was this whole group with a name, I could say, well, it's furry fiction. Lots of people write it. And then be like, oh, okay. Somehow that's more of an answer. It's not really. But there is this strength in coming together, and people keep coming together. Just a couple weeks ago, the 3 of us were at a convention for Landia selling books, and there were so many young people showing up. The convention skewed very young this year. And this is a genre that's going to keep growing and keep getting bigger because it's lovable and people want it. And yeah, that's why Ian threw this to me, because I am very passionate about this topic.
Yeah, she got furry added to as a category on Submission Grinder.
Yeah.
I would love it as a category on Amazon. We're not there yet.
Oh, yeah.
But
Yeah.
eventually, hopefully.
Yeah.
They don't
That's
listen.
what the readers want. You know, the readers want to find a certain kind of book. That's what categories are for. I think I think the signs are all over other media. You know, you've got top grossing box office movies that are furry. You've got people sleeping overnight in the street to get their copy of Animal Crossing. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. You know?
Yeah, what's the new one that just came out? Bad Guys, the
Yep,
all
yep.
animal heist team. So yeah, so we got a few more questions. So as someone new to the entire concept of furry, what are the best gateway novels for furry fiction? And I think we mentioned earlier going to the awards pages, and the Ursa has the recommended reading lists. That's a great place to start.
Those are good. I mean, it's going to depend so much on what kind of fiction you like, because like we talked about earlier, it is a genre that overlaps with other genres.
Right. I think my answer would be you've probably already read one.
Yeah.
I think about Call of the Wild, you know, I think about Jack London and Wind in the Willows and Secret of Nim. So if you want something current, then yeah, I would look at the awards list, or, you know, any one of our novels work. But there's some really good material being put out by the Guild and Guild members. And I still find books on Amazon that I have no idea who this person is. They're not a Guild member. I've never heard of them before. I just picked one up. It just, you know, once you teach Amazon to show you what you want, you find all kinds of things. But yeah.
Oh yeah, somebody said Mr. Frog. Yeah, Totem Mr. Frog.
Yes.
Definitely
Oh.
very furry. So the guild's name is the Furry Writers Guild. We just Google search. I can't remember the website. But we do have another question. Let's see. Do you see more of furry fiction being alternative timeline, like Our World Turned Furry, or DNA manipulation? I can't talk. I'm sorry. And I can't really say. There's such a mix of, and I think it's going to skew towards what you like to read, because as Francis said, once you show Amazon or the algorithm wherever you buy books what you want to read, that's what it's going to show you. So it never shows me furry sci-fi. There's probably a ton of it. I don't read sci-fi, so it shows me the shifters and the fantasy stuff. So I really couldn't say. You get the same mix as any subgenre, I think. So
yeah, I think you get more of the kind of alternate timeline if you're looking at the more mainstream feeling fiction, where like furries would call it Fox and Starbucks. So Secret Life of Animals is what we call it when it's like animals in our world being normal, but we get to see what they're thinking and doing. So that's Watership Down. Whereas Fox and Starbucks is more in the Zootopia direction, except Zootopia actually did some pretty neat stuff with the different sizes of animals and having the society be really built for the animals. And sometimes it really is literally a fox in Starbucks. You'll see that if Kyle Gould is a big name in furry fiction, and he writes a lot of that stuff. He's very good at that.
I think if you took the sum total of furry writing, regardless published or unpublished, just people writing about animals, it's probably going to skew towards the Fox and Starbucks, because people kind of plug in themselves as animal into scenarios. So but yeah, I'm not sure if you look at like just published furry works, if that would stay, or if it would lean towards the speculative element.
I think that's less common in things that get published under the sci-fi fantasy umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
So like in Zooscape, you're not going to see as much of that, because Zooscape certainly favors science fiction and fantasy, because I'm the editor and I love science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah. I don't see any more questions, so I don't know if you have another topic.
So one of the things I don't think we've touched on is what furry fiction can be really, really good at is being a metaphor for for things in the real world, but giving a sense of separation from it. So I just mentioned Kyle Gould and his books, and a lot of his books are like coming out stories. And he's got all of these people who've come to him and told him how important they were for him, because because they were reading about animals. I mean, I don't want to speak for these specific people, but in general, if you're reading a story about animals, it gives you this separation. And sometimes it lets you talk about things that are harder or dark that would be too hard if it was just people. I think one of the most amazing examples of this is Mouse. That is, I mean, such an unflinching look at the Holocaust, but because it's cats and mice, you can read it in middle school, and it's incredibly powerful, but making it cats and mice softens the edges enough that you can look at something it's just too dark to even look at most of the time, but we need to look at it. So furry fiction gives us this avenue for dealing with hard things. Either if you want to take that somewhere.
Well, and I think that's another thing that's built into it, the allegory, because fables, our original furry fiction were fables and just so stories and morality tales, and and then we move into things like Animal Farm and allegory, and I think it's almost instinctual to substitute in. We symbolize animals so much, they can be very symbolic, and you can use that, or you can also like flip those stereotypes and use that really well.
I love flipping stereotypes when I write about animals. Like in my Otters in Space books, I play with that a whole lot. That there are ways that cats and dogs expect each other to be, because there are ways we expect cats and dogs to be, but they don't always line up with that. I mean, if there are in the real world cats who act like dogs, and dogs who are more what we would call cat-like, and playing with those boundaries can actually be a kind of amazing metaphor for playing with boundaries about like gender or sexuality or race, which is something that you also need to look out for if you're writing furry fiction, because readers will read into allegories. They'll imagine allegories that are there even if you weren't planning on it as the writer. So it's important to look for what you're saying. If you have a world that you've set up where every dog is exactly dog-like and every cat is exactly cat-like, that's a very rigid structure, and people in the real world looking at it might feel like, oh, I don't know where I would fit in that because I don't fit easily in the boxes in the real world, so that looks like an uncomfortable place to be. It's too rigid.
We do have a couple more questions that popped up in the chat. I like a lot. Let's see. Where does furry fiction and furry sexual kink divide and join? That's a really hard question.
Actually, I think it divides at the 18+ line. If you're writing adult fiction, or if you're writing YA, or if you're writing erotica. I mean, from a writing standpoint, you're not going to have that in a book that's YA. You're going to have that in a book that I just don't think it's that different.
Yeah. Let's see. Somebody else said, oh, what are your favorite furry fiction tropes?
Okay.
I know I mentioned already, I really like shifters. Just because I think because I would love to be able to turn into an animal, so it's fun to read about people do that.
I really like.
Go
ahead.
You can just speak.
Just talking words. I was gonna say I actually like ferals. I like the Watership Down, Call of the Wild style quite a bit. Warriors Cats, books that are about animals that actually, unbeknownst to us, are people like.
Obviously, I like the Uplift and the aliens that are animal-like. I really like unlikely friend pairings, types of animals that wouldn't obviously get along, and combining them and seeing how they get along.
Yeah, that's fun. I've played with that too, with my beaver who's dating the the bull. So yeah, that's a good one too. Let's see. Somebody else asked, would paranormal romance with shifters be considered furry? And that's gonna depend on who you ask. I think they're furry, but
the PNR authors might disagree.
Yeah, a lot of PNR authors, if you call their stuff furry, they might get really mad at you.
But they might be wrong. I mean,
yeah.
I would guess it might be a kind of a case by case basis. Again, like if you're spending very much time with them shifted, the more time you spend with the characters actually shifted, the furrier it's going to feel. Yeah. The happier they are about being shifted, the furrier it's going to feel.
Yeah, kind of like your example with the werewolves. If they don't like being shifters and they're doing everything to like try and cure themselves, it's probably not furry because they're rejecting the furry part of themselves. Whereas if it's a shifter who's totally embracing their shifter side and spending half their time as a mouse or whatever, it's definitely very furry.
I don't know. So. It's like, you know, the character in the Lego movies who his entire personality is he loves spaceships and he's just like spaceships, spaceships, spaceships.
Yes.
Some of us are like that about furry fiction. It's like animals, talking animals, yay. So you have to think about that reader. And is that reader, when they read the book, going to be like, yeah, that was a great book. There was a whole scene where they were talking animals. Or are they going to be like, well, I kept waiting for animals. It's like, when I was a kid and I learned there was a movie called Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, I thought, that sounds great. And my mom told me there's no cat in it. It's like, that is terrible. Similarly, the movie That Darn Cat is, you know, it's an old movie and there's like a cat that gets lost and everybody's chasing it around. It's always with the people and I found it disappointing. Whereas the cat from outer space, the cat has this lamp collar and can talk, and the whole movie follows this cat, and it's wonderful, and I still love it. So if it's furry, then somebody who gets excited about things being furry will be happy after they read it.
It's a good point. There's a certain expectation from furry readers to have, you know, the animal body language and the animal senses and lots of tails and ears and you know, doing things with your paws and if it didn't have that, I don't think that you'd be really hitting those marks with a furry audience.
Yeah, like Turning Red, where she embraced her panda side. I love that movie. It's so furry, but other people might disagree because, you know,
I loved it too. I was very afraid for a while there that she was going to get rid of that panda.
No, don't get rid of your panda.
Oh yeah, all the furries would have been so disappointed. It's like the end of Beauty and the Beast, where he stops being the Beast. He's just like, oh.
Oh no, all the furries are like, oh.
Generic Prince. Like that's an anti-furry moment there, yes. And something that otherwise kind of appeals to furries.
Somebody's asked, what's their question answered? Yeah, Wolf Keeper. That's what we were just talking about. Like, with the paranormal romance, if you're, basically we were talking about if the paranormal book kind of embraces them being animals, it's very furry. But if it's more of a rejection, then it's not as furry. But again, the line's going to depend on who you ask, as with everything.
You really do. I mean, there was a movie Wolf from the 90s where Jack Nicholson is turning into a werewolf. And most of the movie, he's just Jack Nicholson worrying about turning into a werewolf. But by the end, you get the sense that he's glad that he turns into a wolf and runs away with Michelle Pfeiffer, who's also going to turn into a wolf and run away. And I always really liked that movie. And I think that it's because, you know, in the end, it's positive about being a wolf. And that felt really good to me.
I think it's a good point. It's about tone. What Ian said about Beauty and the Beast, you know, and they all turned back into people. It's not a happy ending in a furry story.
Yeah.
Well, it's still pretty furry all the way through. It's just, It doesn't land the end.
Yeah. Yeah, and somebody else commented, I just like when people think about furries or non-humans as some kind of cop-out. Sometimes you just want to write about talking animals. It's like, yes. Like, I think Francis and Mary mentioned their first book, but my first book, there's not a human in the entire book. It's all just wolves and flower people. And I just wanted to write about wolves, and it was very confusing for my writing group because they were all like literary fiction writers. And I'm like, well, but why are they all wolves? Because I want them to be. So yeah, sometimes you just want your characters to be animals.
This is why sometimes though I will make the point of putting a human character in there for readers who aren't as much entirely in the world of furry fiction to latch onto. I think that's part of how I landed my Entangled Universe trilogy with Aethon books, is that the main character is human. Her best friend is a big old wolf. Then they're hanging out with a bunny and an elephant and a giant insect. And I mean, basically almost everybody else is either an animal or a robot.
I think that was like the standard advice with science fiction when writing Aliens too, was to make sure you had a human character for the reader to, to filter the experience. I'm not sure that holds true with a furry audience, but yeah, if you're reaching for the mainstream, I think it helps a lot to have that one character. We have to write a person.
It's like the TV show Eureka. It's all these brilliant scientists who understand everything. So the main character is a cop who has no clue what's going on. So they always have someone to explain it to.
Yeah.
So that the audience isn't always lost. And that can be nice with furry fiction, to have that human as that kind of anchor point for the reader. Because your reader is probably a human. Probably so far.
As far as we're aware.
Most likely.
But yeah, when you get so I'll sometimes think like, is this book that I want to write one that I want to send out to other markets, or do I want to send it into furry markets that I'm more familiar with, because that might affect whether I'm going to stick a human in there or just have them all be animals. And probably the main character is a cat, because I like cats.
I don't see any more questions. So do you have another topic? And we just got a 15-minute warning as well.
15 minutes till we're done.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we've worked through the main points on my outline. So we could talk about like how we pick what kind of animals to write about.
Oh, that's a good topic. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I could start. So I'll talk about this because last year I decided I wanted to write a novel with a red panda because I just really like red pandas. So sometimes you just pick an animal because you really like them, and there's literally no other reason. Why is there a red panda? I don't know, because I want there to be. But other times I'll pick animals on purpose. Like maybe there's a specific trait that I want them to have. Like maybe I'll pick a dog because they're a detective and they need to be able to smell things. Or I'll pick like I recently wrote a story with a sea slug. And I wrote that for two reasons. I wanted to write about a usual ocean creature, but I also really like sea slugs. So it's like sometimes you can have a dual purpose there. Like it's fun to explore different aspects of like what this animal could be versus what they are. I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
I think sometimes certain species physiology or natural behaviors lend themselves to, like, you have, seahorses where the males give birth. That would be an interesting story that said one thing, or for me, a lot of times it'll be a meme or something will go by on Facebook with animals doing bizarre things, because animals do pretty bizarre things. Or you're watching the Discovery Channel or something. I saw a meme of these monkeys in a tree, and there was a tiger cub, and they kept like hanging down and pulling his tail and then jumping back up, and it was hysterical. And things like that spark this idea for a whole explanation behind it that tend to lead to a story for me.
Yeah, nature videos can definitely inspire a lot of furry fiction. I watched this horrifying video about a lioness who kept serially kidnapping baby gazelles. The people making the documentary thought she probably lost a cub, and so she would just keep them and kind of bat them around like a toy, like she's playing with them, but then she'd be all sweet and mothery at them. But either way, they would slowly starve to death because she had stolen them and they were babies. And it led to me writing a story about a cat whose kittens get sold, because that's pretty standard. And so she kind of a mouse showed up at the right time and was like, oh, I see an opportunity here to get adopted and be treated well instead of badly, like be a surrogate kitten. Basically, I tried to soften it because it was so horrifying.
Yeah.
I ended up with a story that most people think is pretty sad, but for me, it was less upsetting than the original documentary.
Yeah.
I think I do a lot of writing about cats just because I like cats. I have cats. I relate to cats. I find that the difference in how cats interact with each other and how dogs interact with each other works well as a metaphor for being autistic in a mostly neurotypical society. And so there's a lot to work with there. So I go to that a lot. My books with the squirrel as the main character, I picked a squirrel because I wanted to sell a novel to this line of novels that were dark fantasy about being lost in a labyrinth. And so it was going to be an underground labyrinth in my book, and I wanted an animal that would feel out of place and especially lost deep underground. And I thought, well, squirrel is a character of the trees and the open air, and it's not a huge stretch that this squirrel goes down into a labyrinth and gets stuck there, but also it will put her very much out of place, and it'll really highlight how dark and creepy this underground place is because she doesn't belong there. She's a squirrel. So sometimes picking an animal that contrasts with what your setting or story is can work really well, or just picking one who resonates for you personally. I bring up octopuses a lot in my fiction just because I think they're super neat. They're fascinating, and I like to put them in fiction. I've got butterfly aliens in my space opera series because people think butterflies are so beautiful, but if you really look at them and you don't get dazzled by the wings, they're creepy looking. Like, if you watch a video on YouTube of them coming out of the chrysalis, or no, going into the chrysalis, it's like that caterpillar's head splits open and it's just blank underneath, and like this is extremely upsetting and creepy.
They also like to gather on corpses.
Yeah.
Butterflies.
So,
I think that
putting them in science fiction, and what I've got is that these aliens usually cut off their wings because they're vestigial, but one of them was found and raised by humans. Humans didn't know about that, so this character just has these big wings that are always in the way, that are beautiful, but when she discovers her own culture, she's like, oh, yes, that would be so much nicer to have them cut off. But she then looks sort of like this monster to humans. So it's just, there's so much you can do with different animal species.
Yes.
I think it kind of a point that came from that is when you're writing furry characters or animals for furry fiction is to make sure that you know as much as you possibly can about their behavior and their, because that's what the furry reader's coming to look for, that you want to immerse yourself in what makes that species more than just a person dressed up like that species. We didn't really talk about zipperbacks, but you want it to act like as much as possible like the animal. And so if you use a species that you're familiar with, like, cats or dogs that we live with, or I did tarantulas and snakes in a couple different books because I've raised them, I've had them in my home for years. Then you can kind of go deeper into the behavior and the natural.
This also means that watching YouTube videos of animals is valid research.
Yes.
Oh, I've got to be watching these cute animal videos. This is research. I can't work on my story until I watch a bunch more of these videos.
I think that's really why we do it. Yeah.
Somebody made a comment in the Twitch: bees and communal insects make fascinating base for an alien furry race. And yes, they definitely do.
Oh yeah, bees. I mean, Ian mentioned earlier the book The Bees. It's by Laline Paul, and it is beautiful. It's, like beautiful high fantasy, except it's just bees. So good.
Yeah. Well,
Cool.
you used something like that with your hive mind flies. They dance like bees, so it's kind of
Yeah, they do. They communicate with each other by dancing.
yeah.
One of the things I've done for picking animals is I actually got like an animal tarot deck. So each card had a different animal on it. And I would just draw a card and be like, well, today I'm going to write a flash fiction about this type of animal. And then the first thing I would do was go to the Wikipedia page for that type of animal and read about them and try to think, okay, so what kind of story can I tell?
Yeah.
I've actually used your randomizer before, that chart you have with the dice. And another thing I do, which maybe I shouldn't, is when I'm like out observing the world and people, is I often find myself going, now, what kind of species would that person be? I don't,
That's fun.
if I were to cast them in my story, what would I make them?
I have gone to the dog park to find characters for my Otters in Space series, because then I'll look at all the dogs, like that dog would be a great barista or space pilot or whatever it is I need.
Yeah.
Trips to the zoo. It's research.
That's
Yeah.
research. That's the thing. It's fun. Animals are fun, and so putting them in your fiction is fun. And it's weird that people make a big deal about it, because it's just like we're just having fun. And readers pick up on that, and they have fun with it too.
Yeah.
So 5-minute warning.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so Francis, since we're here, I really want to know why you picked a camel for your Indiana Jones novels.
That's a good question.
I love camels so much. Okay, but it's not just that I love camels. I actually really wanted a camel. I've since come to my senses, but I really wanted a camel. But originally, when I came up with the character of Dr. Bactrian, this world explorer, I wanted them to always be sort of out of their element. And I was thinking of like, what would be the worst animal to be in the Arctic, or camel. Camel came up. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's a good that's really fun. Although then the very first book you have her go to the desert.
They're in the desert. I know. They haven't even gone to the Arctic yet, but we're getting there eventually.
If you start her off in her element, then you have to over the deep end.
I even have a penguin in this one, and they're not in the Arctic. I don't know what I was thinking.
One of the things, animal characters can sometimes push you into places you weren't expecting. So like in my Otters in Space books, in the first book, you get like halfway in and they're on this spaceship that I had planned out way ahead of time was going to be flooded with oxo agua, which is a breathable atmosphere because it cushions your system and you can accelerate faster. And it was this whole sci-fi idea I had, inspired by a picture of a mouse in my high school biology textbook that had been submerged in a breathable liquid. And I thought, I'm going to build a whole spaceship around that. And there's an octopus character who lives on the spaceship and is always in the liquid parts of the atmosphere. And it flooded, and the main character, a cat, suddenly is in this liquid atmosphere. And I realized, oh, geez, my characters can't talk to each other anymore. Talking underwater is not so great. And from that point on, sign language became a huge part of the Otters in Space series, because that makes sense for how octopi communicate. And, all those tentacles, they can definitely do sign language. And the otters needed a way to talk to each other while breathing a liquid atmosphere. And it's just, animals take you to fun places.
Oh man, octopus sign language could get so complicated. You have 8 limbs to
and color. They can change color.
Oh, and color, yeah.
Yes, really the otters use a much simplified version.
Yeah, they'd have to. They only have 2 arms. So, yeah, animals out of your elements always a fun one.
So I guess we're all down to the last few minutes. Any final thoughts, and maybe mentioning places people can find you, or things of yours that they could look for?
Well, why don't you start?
Okay, I will start. Thank you. Right, so I'm still Mary E. Loud, and I've got a webpage, maryloud.com. Loud is spelled Lowd. I'm on Twitter a lot, and there I am at Ryffna, RYFFNA. NAH. And both of those places will take you to an archive site if you look for it, where I've got tons of my short stories available for free online, including a lot of furry ones. I've had a lot of them in daily science fiction. So a bunch have been published in mainstream places, even though they're furry. And it'll also show you about my books. There's the Otters in Space series, the Entangled Universe series, and the Celestial Fragments one is the one about the squirrel underground. And you should check out Zooscape. Just Google Zooscape magazine, should get you there. And there's tons of free fiction that you can read there for free. And I think it's all really amazing. It was good enough I was willing to read it many times and buy it and put it in my magazine. Okay.
Okay, so my stuff, I have two websites because I complicated things. I have madisonkeller.net, which is my really furry stuff, like the very furry stuff. And then I started a urban fantasy pen name, which is the main characters are humans, but then they have either shifters or talking animal sidekicks, and that's roanrosser.com. I'm also on Twitter a lot. My Twitter handle is on the Twitch, Maddie Keller with 2 R's. Yeah, those are the best places to find me.
And the two of us, Ian and I, we have a book you might want to check out if you're listening to this
yes.
panel called Furry Fiction is Everywhere, and it's a guide to how to write furry fiction.
Yeah, and that ebook is available on all the ebook sites, or you can get the paperback on Amazon. So yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
I'm at francispolly.com. All my social media sites are there. All my books are on Amazon. Most of them are other places too. And the web serials like the Dr. Bacteria and the Camel one and the Unicorn one are on Kindle Vella right now. And I would also just mention, like, as a final thought, second Zooscape, Mary, because I think that if somebody wants to like just dip their toe in some furry stories and they're only going to go one place, I think you're guaranteed to get incredibly high quality stories from a lot of different authors at Zooscape, and it's free. So there's really no reason not to hop over there and start reading. It's a really good magazine.
Yeah.
That's the whole concept behind it, is like, it's an introduction for people to see this is what furry fiction is capable of being.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a lot of different things.
True.
It is. I still think the weirdest one I read on there was the anthropomorphized tear.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
It's a very short one.
Yeah.
I figure it's important to show the edges of the genre.
Yeah.
I think people would be surprised to know that they're more familiar with furry fiction than they think.
Yeah.
Most people have some piece of furry fiction that they already love. They just don't know it's called that.
All right, I'd like to thank the panelists for coming out today. But it is time to write off to Writers Conduit.
Yep.
Thank you.
There were a couple other questions that were asked, and I've got them in my queue. So I will send them to you on the Writers Conduit Discord.
Okay.
So if people want to join the Discord so they can get those questions answered.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
Great.
I did my best to try and grab some. But I'm
Yeah,
surprised.
not a problem.
I missed some. So yeah. All right.
So, thank you everybody for coming out.
Thank you everybody for
Thank
coming.
you.
And we're heading off to the Writers Conduit.